This one's actually not a TV controller, so it doesn't have it. But when there's an input button, when you can have multiple things hooked up to one screen, and with that input button, you can just lounge on your couch, lounge wherever you are, and just change from one source to the other. I remember I have less things plugged into my TV now than I used to, but in university, when I had a small TV, I had my computer hooked up, a gaming system hooked up, one of those, I think it was a Chromecast hooked up at the time, and the TV I had, though, only had 2 inputs. So even with that input button, though, the challenge of getting up to unplug one thing, plug in the next, it just ruins your day. Ruins your day. And just being able to have that input button with everything hooked up and to switch sources is just so wonderful. But what would happen if all of a sudden your devices had a mind of their own and started changing the inputs on you? You're watching, you sit down Monday night to watch the Oilers game 7, and then all of a sudden it switches to something else right before they're going to score. Like that would be terrible. Although, what if it was something on the news that you really maybe didn't want to see, and it was before it came on, it switched to something else, and it's like, oh, that's nice. It could have a mixed. It could be good or bad. Now, yesterday we were cleaning, and I went to turn on some music here, and I was having trouble with the inputs back there. I couldn't see what was on the screen because there was just an issue between the computer and the screen. The inputs were messed up a little bit. And that can be frustrating. So your devices are probably not going to come to life and start changing your inputs on you. But in our world, we have certain abilities to change our inputs. You could technically, you could get up, you could walk right out of here right now and change what you're hearing, you're seeing, you're feeling. I'd prefer if you didn't. I'd wonder what I said. But you have the ability to change your input. You have the ability to change your setting, what you're listening to, what you're seeing. So you have some control of that. But there are certain times when you don't feel like you have control of that. Maybe it's a call telling you that you need to come into work today. Maybe it's a family member or acquaintance showing up at your door and you weren't expecting them. Maybe it's a school saying you were accepted or rejected to a program. Life is full of different inputs in our lives that we have some control over, but others we don't have control over. And when it comes to our relationship with God, we have a certain level of ability to say, God, I'm allowing your input. And when we do that, things change. Amazing things happen. This morning we're going to read about how God chose to input himself into Abraham's life and our world and what happened as a result. We're going to read in Genesis 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and he saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed and then go on your way. Now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. "Where is your wife, Sarah?" they asked. "There in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself, and she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." When the men got up to leave, they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. So we have this moment where God shows up. He enters into Abraham's world. And interestingly, we see 3 strangers. And while sometimes I have heard, and we may be tempted to look at this as these 3 are the Trinity, God in 3 persons here, it seems to be that it's more God with 2 angelic messengers, which in the next chapter you can read heading into Sodom. But nevertheless, God appears to Abraham. And though it seems that it almost seems as though it's Abraham who initiates contact. See, Abraham rushes out. He sees them and he rushes out to meet them. God could have easily chosen not to appear at all, but he shows up, and Abraham is ready. The fact that God decides to enter their world should astound us. That God decides to be in this world. He doesn't settle for a phone call relationship. He doesn't settle for just speaking to Abraham from a distance. He decides to go in person. See, while I'm very grateful for the technology we have, I'm sure that most of us, if not all of us, have taken advantage of being able to video call family, friends, especially 2020, those few years that blended in together, that we were able to stay connected with people despite not being able to meet in person. And yet, I think that those years showed us how important in-person connection really is. How important it is to be together. And I'm convinced that nothing can replace in-person connection. And God decides to step in the world that He designed, the world He created, to deepen His connection with His creation. This isn't just a friend going to another friend's house. This is the Creator entering in to what he has made. And it was a creation that had started to choose a different way, diverting away from what God had originally intended. And it was getting more and more ugly. And instead of ignoring it, God could have just kept talking to Abraham from a distance. He didn't even have to talk to Abraham, really. He could have just been like, okay, we're just gonna leave that to its own thing. But God instead decides, no, I want to be a personal part of what's happening. God shows his great love and inputs himself into his creation. He shows up. Now, it almost seems that Abraham and Sarah could have very well missed him. Seeing these mysterious men, Abraham could have just kept to himself, be like, okay, they'll leave, they'll go on their way. He could have been justified in reaching maybe for a weapon in a time with crazy people around, with evil around. He could have reached for a weapon just in case to protect himself and his family. But instead, he decides to hurry out. But not even just to speak to these men, but to offer them incredible hospitality. We read in verse 6 to 8, so Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. Quick, he said, get 3 seahs of finest flour and knead it and bake some bread. Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to the servant, who hurried to prepare it. We see God's incredible love as he enters into our world. And we see Abraham choosing to reflect that blessing that he was called to offer to people. And it's a good thing he did, because he was able to welcome God's input into his life. He and Sarah both quickly moved to offer the best that they can to these strangers. See, we can get so easily wrapped up in our schedules, so easily wrapped up in what we have to do, things we have to worry about, think about, get done. And we can miss ordinary opportunities to show extraordinary love. I'm constantly being challenged to allow for small interruptions to my daily life. To be open to, God, what do you want to do right now? Holy Spirit, what do you want to say to me? What do you want to show me? Who do you want me to be with right now? Let's be open to having our input changed. We will find that we will see God and meet with God more readily when we allow him to change our input. And because Abraham and Sarah were ready for it, they were able to speak with God and be with him. And God was able to reassure them of the promise he already gave them and give them more detail of how it would unfold and when. But this pleasant meeting, it starts off with a wonderful feast, some wonderful promises that are just unbelievable. But then it turns into a serious discussion. Verses 17 to 21. Then the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just." so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. This discussion can leave us with a few questions. Why is God telling Abraham? Why does God need to go down and see? Doesn't God know everything? What is God going to do? What is God going to do about it? See, God meets with Abraham. And just as a friend who decides to inform another friend about something that, you know what, you've probably had times where you've talked to a friend or they've talked to you and said, you know what, I'd like if you kept this to yourself, but I just want to tell you what's happening in my life. Or I want to tell you what's going on. And God reinforces what he has said about Abram and how he is working in Abraham's life to make him into a father of many nations and a blessing to the nations. And he says, Abraham, I'm going to tell you what's going on. He invites Abraham into the discussion to deepen their relationship. Now, God being God knew exactly what was going on. He's not one to mistakenly rush into decisions. He knows exactly what's going on. But to show Abraham and to show us that he is a God of love and a God of justice, he enters into our world to experience, to see. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Justin Trudeau, or for that fact, any prime minister that we have ever had or will have, had the capacity to hear every single complaint firsthand, legitimate complaint that our country so needs to change or needs to have solved. And wouldn't it be awesome if he had the time and ability to step into each one of those situations, to fully grasp what was going on? See, it's almost unheard of kings, presidents, prime ministers being able to enter into these situations, to truly bring about the best response. And yet we see God saying, I'm going down. I'm going to be in it. This is not something that I'm going to just decide as you go through it. This is not something that I'm just going to pass off or let go. I'm going to be there. Sometimes we can wonder where God is in moments. We can wonder if God is hearing us. And we see in this moment where God is saying, these cries have reached me. I hear them. I know. God knows what's going on. He hears your cries. And he's there. And so God mentions this to Abraham. And he just says he's going to check it out. And yet Abraham responds, knowing that there is going to be an answer. God doesn't say what he's going to do other than I'm going to see. And yet Abraham seems to know that something is going to happen. In Genesis 18:22 and 23, the men turn away and went toward Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham approached him and said, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" See, God didn't mention what was about to happen, and yet the cries of Sodom and Gomorrah, the evil that was present, not only had reached heaven, but it seemed to have reached Abraham as well. See, these places were probably well known for what was going on. And Abram knows that judgment is coming because the state of these cities is so bad that everybody knows what's going on and something needs to be done. And yet, Abraham, knowing what he knows, still has compassion for those who have completely and continue to completely devalue humanity and creation. And given the opportunity to provide his input, he actually models what Jesus calls us to do. Jesus said in Matthew wrote in chapter 5, verse 44, "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." The people of Sodom and Gomorrah were enemies of what Abraham had been called to live out. And yet he turns to God and speaks to him on their behalf. And this is the conversation that they have. Starting in verse 24, Genesis 18:24. "What if there are 50 righteous people in that city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? The Lord said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Then Abraham spoke up again, "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5 people? If I find 45 there," he said, "I will not destroy it." Once again he spoke to them, "What if only 40 are found there?" He said, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." Then he said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there?" He answered, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." Abraham said, "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 can be found there?" He said, "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." Then he said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there?" He answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. This is a moment that we sometimes can look at God and with the same attitude of Abraham say, "God, don't you have love and compassion?" We can look at God and say, "Don't you have the same love and compassion that Abraham does? Don't you have more than Abraham does?" And yet, you continue reading, and you see this destruction of the city. Where is the God spoken of in the Psalms? In Psalms 145:8, we read, "The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love." Where is the God we see who dies for his enemies? Did God change? Does God change? Make no mistake. God is not changing. God hasn't changed. God always has a redemptive plan in place. God always has a redemptive plan in place. Yet, he gives us and all humanity the constant choice to refuse or participate in that plan. Somehow the people of those towns had become so accepting of evil that justice had to be done. Justice had to be done. It's interesting. Sometimes when you talk with people, when I've talked with people about God and they point at where God has done things, brought about justice in that we read of in the Bible. They say, how could God be so loving and do that? And yet, those same people would look at convicts or people committing crimes and say, yeah, we need justice. We need justice. Sometimes we can look at God and say, why doesn't he forgive everybody? And then we'll turn around when someone cuts us off on the highway and we'll hope that we'll see them, we'll pass by them as flashing lights have pulled them over. We want justice for things done against us. But we don't want God to execute justice in a way that we think is wrong when we don't have the full story. We want God to offer absolute forgiveness with absolutely no strings attached. And then we'll burn for desire for justice when the smallest thing is done against us. The original language points us to a powerful truth about forgiveness. Genesis 18:26 says, "The Lord said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." The word spare is the Hebrew word nasa, which means to carry. I will spare, I will carry the whole place for their sake. God says, I will carry the burden of it. See, forgiveness isn't just wiping clean of an offense. It means someone has taken the burden of that offense and accepted the consequences on behalf of themselves. See, if I was to borrow $100 from you, anybody up for that task, I'll borrow it, and then you need to forgive me of that borrowing. Does that mean you automatically have $100 back and we're good? It means I might be left off the hook, but you're $100 poorer. Forgiveness means accepting the burden of the consequences and saying, I forgive you, and I will take that upon myself. When God forgives, he carries the repercussions of the relational damage that has occurred. See, relationships are much more complicated than monetary transactions. And oftentimes when things are done, they can't be undone. They can't be unsaid. And when God forgives, he carries that relational damage upon himself. Justice, forgiveness, and grace are seemingly impossible things to balance, and yet God is able to do it perfectly. So perfectly that it's hard for us to understand sometimes how it works. See, if God had refused to bring about justice, what about the people that were being affected by the people of Sodom and Gomorrah? The people outside those cities that were abused, treated poorly by the people of those cities. See, we need justice, and yet God still offers forgiveness if we choose to accept it. And we see in this story that God refuses to judge from a distance. He enters our world to see, to taste, to smell, to grow weary. We see this perfectly in Jesus, who lived among us, lived among those who he created and died for them. Hebrews 4:15 says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin." He experienced this world. He knows our perspective, and he knows God's perspective. God has continuously shown from the beginning that he is invested intimately with his creation. He desires to be intimately invested in you. Relationship with him is central to his purpose for us. Just as it was for Abraham. Just as it was for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. It probably won't look exactly like what Abraham experienced. It won't be exactly like what Jesus and his disciples experienced, but God inputs himself into our world in so many different ways, and he wants for us to be open to him, to embrace him, to get to know him. You can read in Genesis 19 what happens when they go and check out Sodom. They wait in the square. Typically, that was a place when you were traveling, you'd wait, and people would invite you into their homes, treat you well as travelers. But Lot goes to the visitors and says, "Come to my house, it's not safe here." See, each one of us has this choice to be open to God's input into our lives. And sometimes we are afraid of what that will look like. We can be afraid of when we open ourselves to God's input to every part of our lives or certain parts of our lives. We can fear God's input and look at what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah and say, if we allow God's input, that's what's going to happen. But that's not at all what happened. See, that's what happens when you don't allow God's input. When you constantly and totally reject God's redemptive plan to bring about new life, to bring about his truth, to bring about joy, to bring about love. When there is a total rejection of God, how can you expect the goodness that he wants to offer you to come to fruition? And we see in Abraham's life what happens when you are open to God's input. When he rushes out, spends time with God, speaks with God. He sees the promises of God unfold in his life. So what would it look like if you allowed God's input into your life? Maybe it's that initial acknowledgement that God has inputted himself into your life, into your world. And it means you being open to a relationship with Jesus. For others, maybe it's that need to take a bit more time and say, God, okay, I want to hear your input. I want to know your input on my everyday life. Maybe that looks like getting up a little earlier to spend some time in the quietness of the morning and talking with God. Maybe that looks like asking God, how do I treat this person the way you see them every time you meet someone? Maybe it's you saying to God, okay, I've kept this off limits from you for too long, and I'm ready to hear what you have to say about it and what you want to do about it. See, I bet you already know the answer to the question, how can you allow God more input into your life? I bet you know the answer to that question. What's stopping you from letting it happen? Music team can come to prepare to lead us in song again. See, when we allow God his input into our lives, he gets rid of what is damaging. He seeks to get rid of what is not good for us. And he desires to bring about the promises that he makes clear to us through Jesus. Not always in our timeline. We see that in Abraham's life. Not always exactly when we want it, but always in the best way possible. And as we sing, Christ is enough for us, let's remember the truth of that. Let's seek his input into our everyday lives. And whatever you need to do to allow him more input, make a plan for that to happen. Let's sing together.